students, dear guests, I warmly welcome you to Ljubljana. I'm very happy that we are meeting face to face today after 2 really difficult years. During these 2 years, our lives have been censored in ways most of us never thought possible. We were deprived of meetings with friends, family, and colleagues. Let us hope that this is a thing of the past now. However, as we have seen over the past 6 months, new challenges are emerging everywhere in the world. Life of people in the Ukraine will never be the same again. A year after the political change in Afghanistan, women are once again protesting basic human rights: the right to live free from violence and discrimination, the right to education, the right to work, the right to vote, to name just some of them. And last but not least, the right to freedom of speech. Regrettably, recently we again witnessed an attempt to silence a writer. So the issue of censorship, and particularly gender censorship, is not just a historical fact. Therefore, I think that we really have the privilege of talking about it freely. Allow me now to look back briefly and explain the history of the workshops on intimacy. The first initiative to explore intimacy in the context of women writing was the workshop Rethinking Intimacy in Women's Reading and Writing, 1700 to 1900, held in September 2016 at the Faculty of the Foreign Languages, Dimitri Cantemir University in Bucharest. The second workshop at the University of Gothenburg, Rethinking Intimacy in Women's Reading and Writing at the Peripheries of Europe, narrowed the scope and focused on the peripheral areas of Europe. The workshops aimed first to invite the research community to identify possible areas for the study of aspects of intimacy in the context of women's literary practices, and then to locate the cultural category of intimacy historically and geographically on the fringes of Europe in the long 19th century. In the third workshop, we will look at censorship and the mechanisms that can hinder but also stimulate women writers' creativity in articulating themes related to intimacy in a broader European context. The titles of the papers are most interesting, and I look forward to the talks and discussions. Now I would like to give a floor to Dr. Alen Širca, the president of the Slovenian Comparative Literature Association, which is also the co-organizer of this event.
I extend my greetings on behalf of Slovenian Comparative Association, which, as it was mentioned, we were one of the co-organizers of this event, and maybe some words about our association. We are active now almost 50 years in Slovenia, and for quite some time now our main mission is to organize international conferences, workshops, or colloquiums in the very broad scope of contemporary comparative literature. This is the one side of our endeavor, but on the other side, we are also sort of a publishing house, because over 40 years we are publishing one of the major scientific journal in the field of comparative literature. I brought an example with me. This is called Primerjalna književnost. simply it can be translated comparative literature, and is very well regarded in the international scene. And so we also invite you to maybe send your papers sometime in English if you are a foreigner, or in Slovenian if you are a Slovenian researcher. So I brought with me this specimen. I will maybe give it later. You can check it out a little bit. I wish you a very fruitful work with your exploratory workshop, and also I wish you a great stay in Ljubljana too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alen. And now it's time to start our first session, and I'm now inviting Dr. Carmen Dutu, who is the chair of this session.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. It's indeed, as Katja has explained and expressed, a very, I should say, emotional moment for us from 2 points of view. First of all, because you have heard very briefly the history, so to say, behind this workshop today. And secondly, because under the circumstances, I think that we can really take pride in our achievements. For that, for the fact that we are here today, I really want to thank Professor Katja Mihurko, also a very dear friend, and who does understand the concept of intimacy in friendship. So I would like to invite Professor Mihurko to deliver her speech, introductory speech for today, and I also wish you a very warm welcome for our workshop. Thank you.
Is this on? I think so. Okay. Just check with me.
Yeah.
So, since this is an introductory talk, I would like to explain some terms we will be using in our presentations and discussions, but also illustrate them with examples linked to the history of women writers. I would like to start with the definition of censorship. As we all know, different forms of censoring and self-censoring of literature are as old as literary works, but we can speak of censorship as an institutional invention in a literary work not earlier as in the context of antiquity. The conventional definition of censorship is, as we read in the Encyclopedia Britannica, the following. The changing or the suppression or prohibition of speech or writing that is deemed subversive of the common good, end quote. Or, as Sue Jensen aptly sums it up, censorship is the knot that binds knowledge and power. Historically, we can trace the first form of censorship probably in the trial of Socrates. We can undoubtedly see the connection between knowledge and power. Knowledge brought by Socrates' words, which were supposed to have a harmful effect on young people, and the power of Athenian authorities who deprived him his freedom of speech. However, for the very origins of the word censorship, we have to move to Rome, where the word censor was used in 443 BC. Censor was the officer who conducted the census, regulated the morals of the citizens, counted and classified. Even in this early definition of censor duties, it is clear how important morality is. Next to the statements hostile to the state and religion, in the history of censorship, morality is the most frequent reason for authorities' interventions in the texts. The oldest list of recommended and forbidden books is the decree of Pope Gelasius from the late 5th century. In the Middle Ages, the most infamous attempt to silence women speaking and writing was undoubtedly the burning of a book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, and its author, Begin Margaret Purit, at the stake in 1310. Let me remind you that Beguines were women in the cities of Northern Europe who, beginning in the Middle Ages, led lives of religious devotion without joining an approved religious order. So not just the content of Purit's book, but also her status were problematic for the Catholic Church. One of the taboos Purit has broken was writing the book in Old French rather than in Latin, and she was ordered not to circulate her ideas or the book again. In spite of this, she continued to do so. Book burning can be described as repressive censorship, characterized by taking place when the work is already printed in the public. It may circulate in the manuscript, as in the Purit's case, or be printed or performed. The Catholic Index Librorum Prohibitorum can be described as one of the forms of preventive censorship. Every book that the Catholic Church allowed to be printed carried a so-called imprimatur, Latin for "let it be printed," issued by the ecclesiastic authorities. Any contravention was inflicted with drastic punishments, such as extremely high fines, disbarment, or even excommunication. Index Librorum Prohibitorum was first issued in 1558. The first woman to be placed on the index was Magdalena Hermerius with one of her children's books. Other women include Anne Askew, Olympia Fulvia Morata, Ursula von Münsterberg, Veronica Franco, Paola Antonia Negri in the 16th century. In the 19th century, we find Madame de Stael with her novel Corinne ou Little Lee on the list, and of course Georges Sand. In the 20s, Simone de Beauvoir with The Second Sex and the Mandarins is on the list, but also Maria Valtorta's work about the life of Jesus Christ, called The Poem of the Man-Cat, written in 1959, and this work received the imprimatur 20 years ago in 2002. However, book censorship was exercised not only by the Catholic Church, but also by secular authorities. Let's take a look in the Habsburg monarchy and its censorship system, as it can be summarized based on the studies by the Austrian scholar Norbert Bach-Leitner. In Austria, the strict regulation of state censorship coincides with the Age of Enlightenment. In 1751, Maria Theresa established a censorship commission. Book censorship lasted until the March Revolution, while theater and press censorship lasted until the end of the monarchy. In the spirit of enlightenment, censorship was supposed to push back ignorance and superstition. Furthermore, the task of the censorship was to change old customs and practices that appeared coarse and uncouth in the eyes of the enlightened people. In addition, censorship was to contribute to the development of modern, stricter morals and the refinement of manners. As for women writers, at the time of Maria Theresa, we find on the list of the books banned by the Empress, books by Marianne Agnes Polk, the author of romance novels. Later, in the first half of the 19th century, the following names appear: Marie Adelaide Barthélemy Hadot, Sophie von Brentano, Anna-Lisa Bray, and of course Georges Sand, the latter with 17 titles. Why were Sand's novels so problematic for Austrian censors? Bach-Leitner examines Consuelo, a historical novel that refers unkindly to Austria and is set about half in Vienna. In Consuelo, Sand bluntly attacks the monarchy and its representatives. Her main charge is that absolute power corrupts character. The proximity to the Gothic novel provided an additional argument for the censors to put Consuelo on the list, since everything linked to superstitions was problematic for the Austrian censorship. Georges Sand's historical drama, Les Mississippiens, was also placed on the list of banned works. This play varies the theme that Georges Sand dealt with in numerous novels: failure of love and materialistic thinking against the background of financial speculation. Anti-Semitic tones are also struck in the text. Samuel Bourset is the despised modern Shylock who provides the upper classes with money or shares, but often ruins them financially. Such an image of the Jew was not appropriate, but why? Because Austrian society was also dependent on Jewish capital, and the audience could find parallels with Salomon Rothschild, an important Austrian financier. The moral issues were problematic in this work as well. In Mississippian, as in most of her texts, Sand presents marriage as a field of speculation in which young unmarried girls are treated like stocks on the market. But even if this situation was a reality, young women were not allowed to know about it before marriage. Any allusion to sexuality was problematic, both in the books and in the theater. The censors referred to women when they deleted sentences that alluded to sexuality. For example, one of the censors in Ljubljana rejected, and for Slovenian audience it was Fran Milčinski, rejected a popular French comedy, Florette and Potekala, on the following grounds. I quote, "The play is not suitable for our moral audience, for the wives and daughters of our officials, and for our always numerous student body. The actions and expressions of the play are too obscene." End quote. This assessment reveals to us an important point concerning moral education that appears in the Austrian censorship of the 19th century. Whereas the Enlightenment's concern for cultivating morality arose from the conviction that it was necessary to cultivate the broad masses of the people, and part of this project also concerns the realm of sexuality, in the 19th and in the early 20th centuries, attention was directed towards bourgeoisie, especially, of course, women. The student body, composed of boys, most of whom had already had experience with domestic servants and or in brothels during this period, was probably not the group the censor really cared about. However, the concern for the morality of the wives and daughters of officials is to be taken more seriously into account. At this point, the censorship of the theater collides with the censoring of women's sexual desire, which is one of the key projects of bourgeois ideology, since its regulation or disciplining is based on gender relations and the patriarchal structure of society. If we look at the censorship from the point of view of morality, it reveals itself as a project that not only protects the political immutability of monarchical boundaries, the organization of state apparatus, and the inviolability of the church, but also interferes with the privacy of the individual, the intimacy. Since bourgeois society has created different codes of conduct for women and men, the reception of their works is also different. Thus, the criterion of censoring or rejecting an author's work is not only related to the effect of the work on audience, but the gender restrictions are also inscribed in the act of literary creation itself. Since women writers usually describe the private lives, I mean now, at least in the long 19th century, of their heroines and reflect themes of intimacy, love, friendship, and other relationships, their works are even more exposed to the critical interventions of editors. Women writers also exercise self-censorship to publish their works. By touching on the concept of self-censorship, we move from the traditional definition of censorship to the realm of the so-called new censorship theory, which offers a more complex understanding of censorship. To illustrate this, I would like to quote Annette Kuhn, who explains the concept of censorship as follows, I quote, "Censorship is not reducible to a circumscribed and predefined set of institutions and institutional activities, but is produced within an array of constantly shifting discourses, practices, and apparatuses. It cannot therefore be regarded as either fixed or monolithic. It is an ongoing process embodying complex and often contradictory relations of power." End quote. So, how are authors' gender and censorship related? Barbara Becker-Cantarino writes about this in her research on German romantic female authors, where she introduces the concept of gender censorship. Becker-Cantarino notes that in the canon of German Romanticism, I quote, "the discourse on sexual difference and writing functions as a discourse of censorship," end quote. Becker-Cantarino shows that the German philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte sternly restricts women's writing to certain types of text, to useful, moral, popular literature, excluding their products, as he calls their texts, from the realm of art, from what was to become the new aesthetics of classicism and romanticism. He directs women to serve their own sex only and explicitly bars them from what he and men of letters of his age considered to be the male domain of scientific or philosophical works. Such restrictions are framed within the context of natural law, which makes them appear as what nature herself has ordained for women. Cantarino adds that, I quote, "although individual aspects of Fichte's social philosophy and his ideas about marriage were criticized, of course, intellectuals and men of letters of his time nevertheless shared the view that women, including women authors, were subject to men. And like Fichte, they were very intent upon securing the narrow borders of female authorship and censoring any encroachment into their own sphere. Whether as fathers or husbands, as friends or competitors or publishers or critics, they exercised a control function over female authorship that was in part very personal and private and in part openly articulated. This resembled the classic formula for the functioning of censorship: the control by a dominant group, that of men of letters, and male intellectuals over a comparatively weaker group, that of women writers. Having only recently entered the public sphere of literary culture by publishing as a recognizable group by 1790s, the women writers, also labeled scribbling ladies, in German Schriftstellende Damen, or poetic females in Schiller words, were certainly considered to be a group by virtue of their gender and growing number. Goethe also expressed, as Cantarino writes, rigid and prescriptive ideas about the female pen or the female authorship, much as contemporary reviews expressed them again and again. Women writers, as Becker-Cantarino writes, felt obliged to adjust their writing to this norm. They would have men revise it and more often than not have it published under a man's name, or they would even neglect to complete a work in progress. Let us take a deeper insight in their practices. First practice is concealment of authorship. Interestingly, the... What? Oh! No idea.
And you have to let in on Zoom.
What? Still no. Matea, could you? Yeah, call Rock. Okay, I just have two pictures of women writers I want to speak about. So interestingly, in the German cultural sphere, but also in others, writers of older generation, as Becker Cantarino writes, consciously presented themselves as professional authors after a first work received critical acclaim. Though they remained well aware of their status as exceptions, if not anomalies, in literary culture. However, and this is interesting, almost all women around 1800 published their works anonymously or disguised by a male editor or pseudonym. Becker Cantarino also gives the example of Caroline Schlegel-Schelling, who published nothing under her own name, but reported about her writing in the letters. In one of them, she writes, I quote, "On Thursday, Schelling submitted an article that I had composed. I would not have wanted it under my name in any case. Schelling did away with the epistolary form I had initially given it, and incidentally teased me a lot because of my great affection for the play and everything connected with it that had been so obvious. I had to laugh myself, realizing what a feminine appearance it had. With much joking, we removed the traces of gentle hand one by one." End quote. So the second practice is the choice of different literary genres or masquerading. As Becker Cantarino argues, gender censorship led to repressions, omissions, concessions, and modifications in literary text, especially in the novels, which contemporaries read as representations of real life. In her first very successful novel, Die Familie Seldorf, the Seldorf family, Therese Forster-Huber chose the narrative structure of the family novel, which supported the natural gender order to foreground a representation of patriarchal society in order to thematize the daughter Sarah's refusal to marry, motivated to be sure by masquerading as an unfeminine soldier-like female revolutionary. Not only the family novel, but also, as Malvi Roberts shows, the Gothic novel, due to its transgressive nature, enabled women to subvert the censorship that prevented, female writing from confronting taboos such as incest and rape. We should also not forget that women writers often have used ironic self-representations that emphasize their fragility, sensitivity, or even inability to write as male writers do. So the first and the last practice is the fragmentation and unfinished work. Dagmar von Hoff writes that, I quote, "The correlation between literary production and self-censorship can be observed above all in the gaps and deformations of the dramatic form that contribute to the fragmentary character of Caroline von Günderode's dramas. The play Magie und Schicksal has an open end, as does the drama Nikator. The mini-drama Hildgund breaks off without warning, and Mahomet is also a fragment. The only piece that has an ending is the drama Udola. The drama Hildgund, so Caroline Schlegel, now we are here, Caroline von Günderode. The drama Hildgund, which is based on the Attila legend, formulates women's claim to action without actually making the deed a part of the dramatic action. The drama inscribes Hildgund outrageous claim to action and leaves a strange gap, an absence of sense. Where a male hero would be able to step away, this drama breaks off because of the desire of the heroine, formulated in a monologue, appears immoderate. End quote. In the last part of my talk, I would like to turn to the gender censorship applied by critics after publication. Let me first recall one of the early receptions of Sappho's work in the Attic comedy. The latter attributed to Sappho many lovers who lived before or after her, so that even the Roman philosopher Seneca seriously wondered whether was Sappho a public whore, and Byzantine grammarians even theorized that there were two women of that name. One was said to have been a famous poetess, the other a notorious courtesan and heroine of comedies. In the 2nd century, the Roman Catholic writer Tertullian painted an even more negative picture of her when he wrote about her promiscuous sex life, which was said to have been described shamelessly in her poems. Of course, such portrayals did not affect Sappho's work, since they occurred only after her death, but for many women writers, equating their literature or heroines with themselves and their intimate lives had far more negative consequences. If we look further east to Russia, which next to Austria has historically had the strictest censorship in Europe, we cannot get past Eudokia Rostopchina and her ballad Nasilni brak, the forced marriage. As Schlossberg writes, I quote, the Rostopchina ballad became the subject of rumors and parlor conversations. Many believed that Countess was publicly describing her unhappy, incompatible marriage to Count Andrei Fedorovich Rostopchin. This, though, was not the cause of the poem's censoring. The difficult plight of married noble women already belonged to the emerging Russian women question polemic. More to the point was the popular pressure on women writers to keep their personal lives out of their publications. Most damaging was Emperor Nicholas I's interpretation, seeing the old baron as representing him and the wife, Poland, forcibly married to the Russian Empire. The emperor summoned the Rostopchin family from Italy, where they were, to St. Petersburg in a private meeting, condemned the poet for her ballad. Despite her pleas of innocence, Rostopchina was banned from all court activities. The Rostopchin family moved to Moscow, then later in 1847, and around this time the countess abandoned poetry in favor of writing prose, blank verse dramas and stories. It was quite a regular practice that the descendants or friends of women writers acted as censors by destroying their letters. I recall here the granddaughter of Madame de Sévigné, who burned a bundle of her letters in which she found too much of her grandmother's joie de vivre. But even where letters did exist, their texts were tampered with and edited. Peter Saber writes that in the first collected edition of Jane Austen's letters, published in 1884, some passages or even whole pages were removed from the manuscripts. As Deirdre Lefay has shown, the editor, Brabourne himself, wished to print the letters accurately, but was overruled by his publishers, Richard Bentley and Son. In some cases, the surviving manuscripts show that passages offensive to Victorian sensibilities about physical appearances, pregnancies, details of illness, coarse humor, and so on, were deleted from the printed versions. Thus, in a letter to Cassandra, Jane Austen's sister, as we all know, of 22nd May 1813, Jane describes a visit to a girls' school in which the drawing room was, I quote, Jane Austen now, full of all the modern elegancies. If it had not been for some naked cupids over the mantelpiece, which must be a fine study for girls, one should never have smelled instruction. This witticism proved too indelicate for Bentley, and it was deleted, of course. Obviously, Bentley also had to think of the financial aspect of publishing Austen's letters. For the same reason, the editors of the French newspaper Le Matin censored Colette's texts. As Jean Oyala writes, I quote, "Economics as well as morality might convince an editor to suspend publication of a novel, for French newspapers were and are often in continual state of economic crisis, reluctant to lose advisors or readers." Editors reacting to bourgeois sensibilities censored material that would adversely affect their circulation, but no legal action was taken by the French authorities against the publication or the author. In 1922, the novel, Colette's novel, The Ripening Seed, was continued halfway throughout serialization in Le Matin, when readers objected to its theme, the sexual initiation of the male adolescent by an older woman. In late December 1941, the Parisian right-wing weekly Gringoire began serializing Colette's Plaisir, a series of recollections and musing on the theme of homosexuality, male and female. Publication of the second installment ended abruptly, as Colette noted, when the editor, Carbuccia, I quote now Colette, cut my text in the middle of a sentence and sent me a letter informing me that he was calling a halt to ce plaisir, because it was not to the taste of his mass readership. End quote. So I hope that I have been able to show in this presentation that censorship, especially gender censorship, is a very complex issue that is inextricably linked to the concept of intimacy. I have no doubt that over the next 2 days we will deepen this panoramic view with case studies from different literatures and find answers to the following questions. How is censorship linked to intimacy when looked upon within a transnational, transcultural context? How do modes of censoring intimacy change when they travel from one space to another, from literary centers to literary peripheries or fringes? How is the concept of censorship related to women writers' creative processes? How did women writers respond to social and literary censorious expectations regarding their gender and in articulating intimacy? How are women writers' confrontations with censorship of family, friends, mentors, publishers, editors, and critics illustrated or reflected in their eco documents? What are the forms of these reactions, attempts at suppression, control, silence, and the interaction between them? Was the censorship also a productive force, a stimulus to creativity? Did it lead to new literary genre, themes, and other literary devices? How did mentors, editors, translators, and other cultural agents perform interventions in women writers' texts? How is censorship linked to the canonizing processes? I'm confident that in the end of these 2 days, we will not only find diverse and fascinating answers to the above questions, but also raise many new ones. So thank you for your attention, and now I would like to give floor back to Carmen, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you.